Oh, hello. I was just reading this 1,000-page book on the Russian Revolution, helping myself get ready for the world we live in. Okay, so today we're talking about gender inequality, and I'll start by talking about some basic differences or some of the inequalities between men and women. And then I'll be uploading the other lecture on sexuality probably on Monday or Tuesday. I've got kind of a sore throat. I'm pretty sure it's allergy related. So my voice is not great today. So anyway, I'm just going to do the stuff on gender and probably upload the next lecture on Tuesday. Excuse me. Okay, so gender is a huge topic of sociology because it's a more complex topic than I think most people realize. We're talking about not just biological sex, male, female, but also how people express their sexuality. And that'll be pretty much the topic of the next lecture. Now, pretty much looking at those, people that generally consider themselves biologically male or female, and, kind of the ways in which they're stratified in society. So I first wanted to kind of, talk about gender in the context of COVID-19, of the coronavirus, because we found some interesting differences here, and we'll kind of return to this in much more detail when we talk about health later. So here, this is looking at death rates, and this is some of the data that came out of China initially. And as you can see there, we've got more males than females who have died, and we basically are seeing that same trend pretty much everywhere. And also not just in terms of deaths, but also in terms of infections. And in fact, sometimes we see more women getting infected by men, and that often has more to do with women in the healthcare sector or women living at nursing homes because women live longer than men. But generally, this disease seems to hit men much harder than women, generally speaking. This is just looking at the numbers in the Palestinian territories, the occupied Palestinian territories. Again, you see a big difference. Way more men than women are getting this. And basically, you see this sort of similar charts, slightly different numbers, but similar charts, in country after country. So, interesting gender dynamic here. What it means, why that is, I'm not sure. There's an article in today's New York Times that discusses it, but I didn't have time to read it before class today. This is looking at the corona cases in Italy, and Italy is probably a good place to look at because what's happening in Italy is very similar to what's going to be happening in the U.S. We're obviously in the United States not going to have the experience that China had, or South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. It'll probably be much more like Italy, where you have a much more open society, came to the game late in terms of shutting stuff down and so on. But here you see the distribution of coronavirus cases, almost 10%, or actually, more than 10%, are men than women. That's pretty fascinating. What the long-term implications of that are unclear. Now, because men are at greater, I'll go over here, because men are at greater risk of contraction and some of the more negative consequences of COVID-19, we shouldn't think that women are immune to it or anything. Certainly not. It's almost just as serious for women as for men, and it will affect women in different ways. So this is going to have a huge impact on women who are giving birth. I have, a friend who's supposed to be giving birth any moment now, and she lives in Seattle, which has been under lockdown for some time now, and has had an exploding epidemic there. They seem to now be getting control of because of social distancing. But anyway, going back to the topic, we're going to see a lot of women's issues and women's health issues that are going to be affected by COVID-19. So we could see a lot of severe health problems arise because our health systems are now, pretty much completely devoted to COVID-19. And this will affect women disproportionately because women disproportionately have various health issues, often related to the fact that they can have children. And we'll get to that when we talk about health in more detail later. Sorry, let's bottle up. Okay, moving on. Oops, I guess I went there already. Okay, moving on now, talking about gender and sexuality and all of these things. When we talk about gender, we're really talking about sexuality and how it's expressed. I guess I'll go over here. We refer to sex in sociology as the biological, sex that a person is born with, male or female, based upon anatomy. Although it's not that simple, because you have intersex people who are born intersex with both genitalia, or sometimes some part of one and part of another, and sometimes then the doctor and parents have to make a decision early on about a surgery that's going to determine that child's biological sex and oftentimes their gender expression. And sometimes that leads to interesting changes later on, where the child grows up and does not identify with with the sex that they were essentially assigned at birth. So it's a more complex. It's more complex than people realize. When people say, "Well, it's all biological," it's like I always caution against using biological arguments, because biology is very complex, and actually biology is anything but straightforward, especially when we talk about things like sexuality. Okay, I thought this was interesting. I just thought I would talk about this right away. We'll kind of return to this again later. This is looking at how men and women who are economists differ in terms of these different areas. It looks at their views on these different metrics. So I wanted to show this because, we've talked a lot about libertarianism, utilitarianism, things like this. Libertarians are generally opposed to governments getting involved in the economy. One thing that I think is interesting right now is that, the world has become very utilitarian. American political officials, regardless of their supposed ideology, are suddenly behaving like socialists and utilitarians in terms of, using the power of government to prop up markets, to prop up the economy, and so on. So, very interesting time there. So this survey was done a couple of years ago. So it asks the economists these different things, whether they strongly agree, or strongly disagree with these statements. The orange is female, blue is male. So you see their importance of core economic principles. Female economists view that as less important. Here's what I think is kind of interesting. Market solutions are superior to government intervention. Pretty big difference in terms of female economists and male economists. Female economists are much more likely to say that male economists are much more likely to say that market solutions, are better than government, that are more likely to hold a libertarian view, which is not surprising because 80% of libertarians are men. Get to that later. Okay, so market solutions, not seen as superior to government intervention by most female economists. Very interesting difference there. In favor of austerity and limited redistribution, you tend to see agreement there. Again, big difference here in terms of environmental protections. Female economists are way more in favor of environmental protections than you see male economists. Female economists are also more likely to see labor markets as being fairly unequal. You can date feminism, modern feminism, back to the 1800s, where sort of a declaration was written at Seneca Falls in New York, And through the whole house movement, the suffrage movement, the fight for women's rights and voting rights and so on, your book discusses that in great detail. Just kind of fast forwarding to sort of the more modern emergence of more recent modern feminism. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, played a big role in this. One of the things that it did was, kind of focus on women. And you see in that book there, her, the woman's face is blanked out. And kind of one of the things that Betty Friedan was arguing was that women's stories were not being told. They were kind of, treated as if they were all the same, and there were the men who are out there changing the world and so on. And she was saying that it's not really like that. When we look at the situations men and women find themselves in today, we find that across the world, girls are generally getting ahead of boys in terms of academic achievement. Boys are less likely to do well, increasingly, excuse me, and across the world, as you can see here. So that's kind of something that's, I don't know whether that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's good that girls are getting, better schooling, are getting more opportunities, and so on. However, I don't think it's good that boys are falling behind and are doing less homework and less studies than they did in the not too distant past. So a lot of this comes down to homework and things like that. So we know that boys, especially in America and richer countries, boys are less likely to spend, boys spend much less time on homework than girls do. So, sometimes you hear some men make the argument that, well, it must be because of feminism, or these attacks on men or something like this. No, that's kind of ridiculous. At least in this case, you can clearly see across the board that boys are spending less time on homework. What are they spending more time on instead of that? You see an increase in the time that boys spend playing video games, and they kind of match up, actually. So that's a big part of it. So again, I think actually a lot of it comes down to parenting, and parents, making sure that boys are spending more time on their homework than perhaps video games. So we see that, girls are more likely to read for pleasure than boys are, and so on and so forth. And again, you can see these statistics growing across the world. And across the world, we see this happening. Now we see a division in work. Now, and this gets to some kind of fundamental question. I'm trying to figure out where to go to not block too much. Okay, I guess I'll just go down here. There, okay. So, as you can see in this chart, we have what's called gender typing, where certain professions are more likely to be occupied by one gender rather than the other. So we see that, that top row of occupations, which are basically mostly in the health profession, overwhelmingly dominated by women. Speech language pathologists, dental assistants, physical therapists, and so on. You have a majority of pharmacists now who are women. Over a third of lawyers, not so many civil engineers, and not very many HVAC installers at all. So pay attention, again, that top line there. This means that, women, it's primarily women who are on the front lines of COVID-19, and not just COVID-19, but on everything that's going to, or just about everything that's going to happen as a result of it. So, we just in the United States lost 10 million jobs over the last 3 weeks. 8 million jobs were lost in the entire Great Recession 10 years ago, and that was over a period of several months. This is 10 million jobs in a few weeks, so this is unprecedented. Anyway, as our society tries to rebuild from this, you're going to find that women are going to be on the front lines of this. Child care, social work, helping people in need. A lot of the helping professions are predominantly women, and they're going to, they're going to be in high demand in the coming months and years ahead as a result of COVID-19 and the recession slash depression we're entering. Now, looking at women in management. Get a drink of water. My voice is not great. Okay, so you can see that on that top row, again, the type of organizations that women are more likely to manage are organizations also that more women are more likely to work in. So human resources, social community services, that sort of thing, education, food service, and so on and so forth. Less so for things like construction managers, computer and information systems managers, and so on. Although I would predict that some of those are going to go up in the coming years ahead. We'll kind of see what happens. In terms of changes, those green bars are 2010, the blue ones are 1970. So you see some big changes. You walk into a bar and order a drink. Back in 1970, you were probably going to be served by a male bartender. If you do it today, you're probably going to be served by a female bartender, as you can see here. About a third of doctors are now women. Roughly about the same amount of lawyers. Chemists and engineers, these percentages have gone up quite substantially. Excuse me. And then you see some areas where you don't see much change at all, such as registered nurses, secretaries, elementary school teachers. So some of these positions, and this is something important to keep in mind, you do see the gender division, and here it might be something that's deep and biological. Why we see nurses and secretary, or especially elementary school teachers in particular, just overwhelmingly these jobs are being dominated by women. This does not mean men can't be caregivers or take care of children or be nurses. Plenty are, and plenty can do that work just as well or better than many women. Nonetheless, it's kind of similar. We see men overwhelmingly in positions in construction, manual labor, and so on and so forth. Not all men. I would be a pretty bad, well, I have been a pretty bad manual laborer. Not that I, ruined anything, but just definitely was not meant for me. I did some landscaping, some roofing for a little while, and nope, don't want to do that. So anyway, so we do see that some of these jobs are fairly gender typed. Like I said, if you look around most of your classes in college, you can't do that right now, I guess. But maybe next time everyone's physically in a classroom, look around. Chances are most of your peers will be women. Now that may differ depending on what class you're taking. Some, such as computer science, are more likely to be men. Interesting stuff happening there. So one thing that we do see happening is something we call the glass ceiling. This is a promotion barrier that prevents women from climbing the ladders of their organization. So this results from a few things. Two of the main things are discrimination. You still have a lot of that going on, and lack of network opportunities. So one of the things we learn in sociology is the importance of social networks and how people are sort of tied to one another. And because women are, sort of new to the upper echelon of organizations, there are less networks that have been formed. And people who have, stronger networks are more likely to get jobs. And so some of this is partly just time, temporal in nature. So within a generation, we'll have more women leaders, so presumably more opportunities for networking. But then there's another reason, and this is something called the motherhood penalty, where women essentially are penalized for, oops, where did I go? Okay, there we go. I'll get to the motherhood penalty in a moment. Okay, so, all right. Kind of related to one reason why women are less likely to rise up to the upper ranks of organizations. This is related to the motherhood penalty I'll talk about in a moment. Something that the sociologist Arlie Hochschild called the second shift. So one thing she found in her research was that women are more likely to, even if they have a full-time job, they're still more likely to come home and do more of the housework than men are, than the men that they are in a relationship with. So we're talking about heterosexual relationships. For gay and lesbian relationships, we'll talk about those next time. But anyway, so we see this. We see that women are more likely to basically have the second shift when they come home. They work all day at an office or whatever, then they come home, still do the dishes, make the dinner, and so on and so forth. Men are catching up in terms of helping with the work, but there's still got a ways to go. So yes, as I was saying, the motherhood penalty. So a recent paper looked at this and defined it as the amount by which women's earnings fall compared with their earnings a year before giving birth. And it finds that the motherhood penalty exists in all these 6 countries it studied, but it varies greatly in size. So the motherhood penalty means that basically women lose some of their earnings after they give birth, and it takes a while, if ever, for them to make that amount again. Oftentimes because women will take time off from their jobs, and it's harder to rise up the ladder if you've been gone for a while, or they'll quit entirely and find a new job, which again, it's hard to rise up the ranks high quickly if you just started a new job. So this is the different, the researchers looked at a number of European countries. And you see there, let me explain how this chart works. I'll look at the United States here. So you've got years before and after the birth of the first child, going from 0, and here's the 0 years. You've got 5 years after, 10 years after, then you've got the time beforehand. So you see already, about a year shortly before, 9 months or so before the child is born, the woman's wages earnings start dropping. Oftentimes, they're leaving the workforce, that sort of thing. Then they, do leave the workforce or take time off, this sort of thing. And as you see, they struggle to raise their wages again. For men, their wages go down a little bit, but not that much. You see there's big drops in some places. For example, in Austria, huge drop. Germany, much bigger drop than what you see in the United States. The United States actually is doing better for women, for young mothers in terms of wages than you see in Austria and Germany. Now, there's a qualifier here. Austria and Germany also have much more generous maternal leave policies. So while their wages may not return, they're basically getting compensated during this time. And in some countries in Europe, you have paternity leave as well, such as I believe Sweden and I'm pretty sure Denmark does. And you can see there Denmark has the lowest drop. So that's if you're going to be a mother and you want to not suffer from the motherhood penalty, which is a terrible way of saying that, I know. But if you don't want to suffer this penalty as much, I guess Denmark is the place to be. I'll see if my cousins and so on can get you a job there, although I don't think anyone anywhere is hiring now. Okay, this is looking at women representation in government. Whoa. Okay. back in 2012, I just want to show this one. I like this map because this chart because it's got the world average here. You see Rwanda, then Sweden. This is women who are serving in legislature, like Congress or Parliament or some such body. And you see this red dotted line is the world average and all the countries that are above it: Britain, Mexico, Germany, Rwanda, South Africa, and so on. And then you've got the countries that are right on the line: Israel, France is below it, the United Arab Emirates is below it, the United States is below it, or it was in 2012. I'm not sure where we stand in terms of world average after 2018. The 2018 midterm election saw more women elected into Congress than we had seen before. So this is looking, kind of the same information, but updated to 2017. That last chart was 2012. Again, you see that, United States, 19% of our Congress is women. Half the population is women. So we've still got a ways to go to be more representative. Again, this is 2017, so 2018 may have changed. I know the numbers went up significantly in 2018, but I, for some reason, did not look that up before this class, but you could do that very quickly on a search engine. Okay. So a couple of things that we, talk about or think about when we think about work that women do. One is that a lot of the work that women do is not given the same value as work that's performed by men. So, for example, work in which, where you do manual labor, that will pay significantly more than childcare. Now, manual labor, you take a greater risk. It's not that men don't face any risks. Men are more likely to work at jobs where they risk their lives, for example. However, the perpetuation of the human race depends upon childcare. So we don't, our society has really devalued childcare, even though this is really something we know is incredibly important, especially as we learn more and more about human psychology, human developmental psychology in particular. We also know that women do a lot of what's called emotion work that involves caring, negotiating, empathizing, and so on. And so if you remember back when we talked about automation, and in the coming, who knows what the job market will look like in the coming years. I don't think automation is going to go away. I think, if anything, we may see, automated systems actually increase, which could be, well, that could be chaotic, or, we'll see what happens. But automated systems are not going to be able to do counseling, are not going to be able to do therapy. They're not going to be able to do a lot of the stuff healthcare, a lot of things nurses do, for example. And, in the coming years, our society is going to need a lot of mental health counselors, social workers, healthcare workers, and so on and so forth. So, very important work that, is going to be incredibly important for the well-being of our society. And, it's long past time that, we started compensating people who do this work adequately. It's far more important what they do than what a lot of people do. Myself probably included. I can maybe argue for myself in the sense that a lot of my students are, going into the health professions, and I'm teaching them about the world and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to be on the front lines fighting coronavirus, but many people who are doing this emotion work will be. Other things. So sexual violence, women are much more likely to be targeted, to be targets of sexual violence. Now, I began my academic career by studying sexual violence during war, and I think I may have talked about that when we talked about violence. And, sexual violence is something that's very pervasive in society. Let's see, what do I have on here? Okay, all right, so when we talk about sexual violence and we talk about rape, we're talking about, we're talking about a crime that oftentimes goes unreported. And this is something that is problematic in terms of getting accurate data but it's also it's a hard crime to address. And I think, legal scholars of the 21st century, this will be one of the big issues. How do we successfully and prosecute rape cases? Oftentimes there's not physical evidence, and so it becomes that classic he said versus she said, and usually there aren't any witnesses. That's just the reality of most of these situations. So that's problematic. Lie detector tests, are problematic. People can work past those, but we are getting better at detecting lies. We are getting better at, understanding biological systems. So maybe there'll be something in that regard. I don't know. I just know that, it's a big problem, and how we go about understanding this. So, with the Me Too movement, I think there's more people are coming forward with their experiences, and I think our society, is getting better at reducing sexual violence. And there's actually, even though there isn't perfect data, the data we do have suggests that's happening. Now, we often hear a number that, 1 out of 5 women in college will be a victim of sexual assault. I've been hearing this number for, two decades at least. And, it's most likely true. In fact, in some places, some schools, it's higher. You look at the numbers by school, and it's actually different. Yale is something like 1/3. It's over 1/3. Alarming. What we don't have numbers on are the percentage of men who are committing these rapes. That is something that's much harder to gather data on. However, there have been these studies. There's one from 2014. My first sociology professor did a survey like this in a class he had of the men in the class, where both found the same percentage, that roughly 1/3 of college men say that they would commit rape if they could get away with it. So that's pretty alarming. That's 1 out of 3 men. So again, as I said, that's a striking finding. Well, as I said, there's some good news. Looking from the 1990s to roughly today, we can see that there has been a drop in sexual violence, in sexual violence assaults. And that's actually continued this downward trend through the 2010s. Need to update this slide obviously pretty soon. But it's kind of in line with other crimes too. Crime has been falling since the 1990s, mostly for demographic reasons. Just the baby boomer generation, got smaller. Gen X got smaller, so you have less young men out there, basically, committing crimes. And so property crimes, violent crimes have all been falling for the most part since the 1990s. Sexual crimes have followed that trend as well. Now, what's also interesting, though, here is that completed sexual assaults have fallen dramatically. Threatened and attempted sexual assaults have not fallen. They've stayed about the same. In fact, one could, this is data collected by the Bureau of Justice. Now, if you were to include, say, online threats and emails and, online harassment and stuff like that, there you could actually see threatened rapes has skyrocketed over the last few years, as it's become this new form of harassment that women have to deal with. But physical attempts have actually been fairly stagnant. You see ups and downs, but really not changing a whole lot over the last 20 to 30 years. As I mentioned, I began my academic career looking at the rape of women as part of ethnic cleansing campaigns. And this was used as a weapon of war to humiliate, the women of the other side and so on. And you see it in these different areas where there's been conflict in the last few years. This is, these rapes are committed both by government forces as well as insurgent forces. Now, patriarchy and a lot of this, it doesn't exist solely based because, just because of male coercion. Oftentimes, a lot of oppression depends upon the sort of passive acceptance by some people who are oppressed. Not always, but it's a big part of how oppression works. So here, this is a striking chart because this is looking at women who think that under certain circumstances, a husband is justified in hitting his wife. So you see here the red line, or I'm sorry, the red dots there are the poorest fifth of the population. The bright blue dots are the richest fifth. And then you've got the countries there on the y-axis. So it's really interesting there, and then you got the percentages up on top. So you see big differences between the poorest and wealthiest women. The poorest pretty much always basically are more likely to believe that, under certain circumstances, it's okay for a husband to hit their wives. And you see big differences in some countries. I mean, in Morocco and Kenya, for example, in Egypt, you see huge, huge differences. But in a lot of cases, you still see, pretty strong, pretty huge numbers of educated, wealthier women believing that it's okay for men to hit their wives. So that's kind of alarming. You see a lot of these countries. It's cultural. It's sort of part of the religion and tradition and so on. You get to Ukraine, more of a Western country with gender notions that are more like in the United States or Eastern Asia. I notice there's not a lot of Eastern Asian countries on here. You see that the rates are much lower. They're within under 10% basically. Now looking at men, I'm not going to talk as much about men because men aren't as unequal, but I want to say a few things because there's been a lot of interesting social science on men and a lot of controversy too. So the American Psychological Association, a couple years ago, they set out some guidelines for how to interact with your male clients. Basically, this is for therapists, psychologists, and so on. And kind of pointing out that a lot of the traditional norms for men about, not showing your feelings unless it's anger, tough exterior, mostly revolving around things like that, engaging in risky behavior, caring a lot about peer pressure. A lot of these things psychologists are starting to find are having negative effects on men's mental health. A lot of this is happening because norms are changing. Some good books I would recommend, the Masculinities Reader. There's a whole bunch of Masculinities Reader, kind of explosion of Masculinities research over the last 10 to 15 years that's worth looking into. I also suggest looking into masculinity and femininity in the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-A. And this is kind of technical. The MMPI is the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, which you can't say without coughing, evidently. No, it's a it's a major personality test. It's probably one of the most in-depth, accurate psychological profiles. So I think like over 100 questions or something like this. Huge. Anyway, so it looks at that in the context of this personality test. So what's going on with men? Well, at a very basic level, the economy is changing. What men used to do and what used to define manhood is oftentimes no longer relevant for a lot of modern post-industrial societies. Now I say post-industrial because we still need a lot of strong people, whether they're men or not, who can dig ditches, who can build roads, who can lay down pipes, who can, who can build, solar farms and wind farms and so on and so forth. So there's certainly a place for the manual labor and the sort of kind of tough masculine work that defined, about masculinity in the past. There's still a need for that, but it's much less of a sector of the economy than it used to be. So we've seen, and I think this chart here is really important because you see back in the 1960s in the United States, men with a college degree, without a college degree, with a high school diploma or not, were basically equally likely to be employed. They could get jobs in factories or wherever. And you see since then on this chart, basically going through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s through today roughly, that for men with a college degree, you're 2% less likely to have a job. And actually, again, this is pre-current recession, but through most of since the 1960s, less likely. You see that jump here. Jump right before the recession that comes down a bit, the recession back in 2008. But you see the big drop for those men who have some college. So why aren't their wages quite as low? Is it because they learned a lot of good stuff in college? Some of that, obviously that helps, but it's probably more the networking. They probably, while they were in college, they probably met some people, and those people said, oh, hey, I know you dropped out of college, but, so-and-so is looking for whatever job, and, I thought of you, that sort of thing. High school or less, you have less opportunities. In general, you have less opportunities for networking, and the economy has changed so that the skills that you need are increasingly skills that you get from higher education. And it doesn't help that, again, this is where we see boys not doing as well in school, where this plays out. It plays out in the job market, in their ability to achieve later on. We also see that this is leading, burping. This is leading to a lot of depression. A lot of these men don't have good health. A lot of them have a disability. A lot of these men are addicted to drugs, opioids. There's a lot of suicides amongst this group, especially these middle-aged men. I've had a few friends who have committed suicide, men who kind of fall into this category. This also, we know that men in general have worse health than women, but you could see COVID-19 hitting men in America particularly hard because, on average, men in America are less healthy than South Korean men. They're less healthy than Italian men. Italian and South Korean people in general eat better than Americans do. And so as this COVID-19 hits America, it's going to hit men harder. We know that generally. And it's probably going to hit poorer men and men who are already, suffering from health problems particularly hard. So I have some deep concerns about America and about men in America and facing coronavirus. Okay, so men in America too. Now, there's this crisis of men in America. Men have been looking for meaning, especially white men. And I'm talking about white men because in the past, usually I would be talking about other men. Men who have not gotten as much attention, men of color and so on. And for a long time, I think when I was in college, that's basically what we would talk about. When we talk about race and ethnicity, for example, it would be usually race and ethnicity except for white people. And now, over the last, 10, 15 years, whiteness in itself has become a topic, as we talked about in the race and ethnicity lecture. So white men are disproportionately sort of affected by some of these this epidemic of suicide and opioid addiction that we see in the United States. We don't see the same levels of African American, Asian, Native American, or Hispanic men, Latino men being affected by opioid addiction, suicide, and so on. In general, as opposed to say 20 years ago, things have been looking up for men in those categories. The job market and education and all of these things for black men are much better than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, back in the 1980s and 1990s. For Latino men, because you have more people who have been integrated into the society, so you have more networks again, that sort of thing, and so on. But white men are sort of in this situation where they've kind of seen their status, kind of falter. And there's some people who argue that it's, you can boil it all down to race, that it's white men who are, concerned about the status of white men in particular. And undoubtedly there are a lot of men who definitely fall into that category, that are sort of white supremacists and these sort of like male supremacists and so on. And one of the things that we see is that this sort of explosion in interest in ancient Greece. So Donna Zuckerberg and Stoicism. Stoicism is this philosophy that's just really taking off right now. Donna Zuckerberg wrote this really fascinating book. I would highly recommend it if you're interested in this stuff, called Not All Dead White Men, Classics in Misogyny in the Digital Age. And she looks at how men have been turning to the classics, to ancient philosophies of Stoicism and so on, to give them sort of meaning and purpose in life. And so a lot of it is in sort of backlash to feminism, or this perception that they're being emasculated by feminism. Again, I think the data, to me, looks pretty clear that it has less to do with feminism and much, much more to do with the economy, with globalization, with the fact that a lot of work now requires us doing what I'm doing right now, sitting in front of a screen, as opposed to sitting with a pickaxe and mining something or whatever. Anyway, I would highly recommend this. But she's kind of talking about this interesting movement that we see developing amongst these men who are kind of looking for meaning in the modern world, and they're turning back to the classics. They're also turning to the classics for, I don't know, lessons on how to treat women or something. Kind of strange. Donna Zuckerberg, you may be like, oh, she has the same last name as the CEO of Facebook. Interestingly, she's his sister. Donna Zuckerberg is the sister of Mark Zuckerberg. Just thought I'd throw that in there, and I remembered this cover of The Economist where he looks like he's from the classic age. Okay. Well, we're also living at a time, when I say at a time, I mean the last few decades, where in a time and in an economic system, open society, where we get to choose. We have a lot of choice in terms of crafting our identity and how we want to, express ourselves to the rest of the world. So androgyny is a big thing, where you're blending masculine and feminine characteristics. And I think we see this, most often with men, which is why I have mainly pictures of men here. In the 1980s, this was a much bigger part of mainstream American, British, European culture, where men were starting to wear eyeliner and, big hair and stuff. You had 80s new wave, which is my favorite type of music. And anyway, you had this sort of explosion in androgyny then in the 1980s. You get kind of a backlash in the 1990s in pop culture with grunge rock. You have gangster rap and things like that, which are much more hyper masculine and much more almost the opposite of what you were seeing in the 1980s with people like David Bowie and Prince and so on. And kind of fast forward to to today, where we have a much more fragmented music and pop culture scene and so on. A lot of the biggest acts are coming out of Asia now, and K-pop, for example, the Korean pop. A lot of this, well, just very interesting by itself, but a lot of the performers are very androgynous young men who, go to great lengths to work on their image to convey an androgynous, more androgynous image. And it's kind of on that note that we'll stop, and I'll upload the next lecture, excuse me, on Tuesday, and that will focus on sexuality in particular. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, sanitize. I know these are very rough times, and remember, just send me. Feel free to send me a message if you have any questions about the project or the class or anything. All right, have a good weekend.